In tonight's news edition, the Prime Minister tells activists that Jordan's nuclear energy program is in the decision-making stage and vows that nothing will be imposed on Jordanians. Jordan and Iraq discuss details of a strategic oil pipeline between the two countries. And Jordan and Britain pledge full support to the Geneva II conference to boost peace prospects in Syria. Good evening and welcome to the news. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour said opposition to Jordan's nuclear energy program stems either from apprehension over nuclear safeguards or doubts about its economic feasibility. He told a meeting with a group of activists opposed to the project that it is up to economists and to the state to assess the atomic energy project, which is still in the decision-making process. He said the nuclear project is subject to more public consultation and technical studies, vowing, and I quote, "Nothing will be imposed on Jordanians unless they are convinced," end of quote. The meeting, attended by Chairman of the Jordan Atomic Energy Commission, Khal, was part of a series of discussions organized by the Ministry of Political and the Parliamentary Affairs. The activists add their deep concerns, arguing that the nuclear project is not a top national priority, citing scarce resources and insufficient amounts of uranium. They pointed out that the Atomic Energy Commission did not conduct the necessary technical, economic and environmental studies. They said many world nations had begun to scrap nuclear projects in the energy mix. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour and Iraqi Oil Minister Abdul Karim Al-Aibi discussed a planned project to extend an oil pipeline from the Iraqi port of Basra and the Jordanian Red Sea port of Aqaba. During a meeting attended by Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources Mohammed Hamid and Minister of Industry, Trade and Supply Hatem Halawani, they talked about the various stages of the strategic venture, including studies and tenders due to be awarded in the next few months. Mansour said Jordan is keen on cementing ties with its neighbor in various fields, stressing that Iraq's security is vital for regional stability. The pipeline will carry 1 million barrels of crude from oil fields in southern Iraq daily for export via the Aqaba port. The Prime Minister said the kingdom is interested in expediting the vital pipeline project, which will secure about 150,000 barrels of crude to Jordan daily at prices to be fixed by both countries. The Iraqi minister said the pipeline would bring economic dividends to both his country and Jordan, noting the prospect of launching an oil refinery and an electric power plant in Aqaba. Today's talks followed Mansour's recent trip to Baghdad, where he held talks on economic cooperation, including the pipeline project. Jordan and Britain said they fully support the Geneva II conference due to be held later this month to boost peace prospects in Syria. Minister of Foreign and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Judah and British Foreign Secretary William Hague spoke during talks in London on the forthcoming peace conference or negotiations in Switzerland. Prospects for progress at the talks in Switzerland on January the 22nd, dubbed Geneva II, appear dim. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, backed by recent militant gains and a wave of rebel infighting, has flatly ruled out demands from the opposition that he stand aside. But Judah expressed hope that talks would lead to a political solution.
Very important for all of us to show our support for and our belief in the process of Geneva II that will hopefully represent the political solution that we all seek for the Syrian crisis that is about to go into its fourth year in a few weeks' time.
The Foreign Minister and I agreed that the unrelenting pressures on Syria's neighbours and the terrible suffering of the Syrian people will only be relieved by a political resolution to the conflict. And that's why we both fully support the Geneva II process as it looks to implement the Geneva Communiqué of 2012 and create a transitional governing body in Syria, in which, in our view, Assad play no part. He's been here many times.
And over to Syria, where at least 18 people were killed by a that went off in central Syria. The escalating violence of Syrian opposition groups, several Islamist rebels representatives met for the first time in the Spanish city of Cordoba to forge common ground ahead of peace talks with the Syrian government last month. More in this report.
A two-day meeting in Spain brought together Syrian opposition groups in an attempt to agree common ground on halting the three-year war in their country. 150 members of Syria's moderate opposition to the Assad regime gathered in Cordoba in southern Spain to try to come to a consensus ahead of the Geneva II peace talks scheduled to take place in Switzerland on January 22nd. Spanish Foreign Minister José Margallo said there was no consensus among the group so far, but stressed the importance of the forthcoming talks in Geneva.
I have stressed, as I have in past meetings both in Spain and abroad, that there isn't a unanimous position for the Geneva conference. It is the opinion of the government that we are before an opportunity for peace that cannot be thrown out. We are perfectly aware of the contradictions within Syria that make participants here doubt the results of this meeting.
Today's meeting brought together members of the Western-backed National Coalition, but also delegates from opposition groups inside Syria. At least 3 members of the Islamic Front, which reject the authority of the National Coalition, had also come.
We are gathered here today, despite our different views, to try to reach a consensus that can save our people.
Diplomats say the gathering is a recognition that the divided National Coalition is losing influence on the ground and a more comprehensive grouping is needed ahead of the talks. 400 police were dispatched to the city for the meeting, which seek to encourage a peaceful transition. In the latest bloodshed, at least 18 people, including women and children, were killed by a car bomb that went off near a school in the village of Al-Kafat in central Syria. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the death toll was likely to rise because some of the dozens of people were in critical condition. Hala Dababne for the news at 10.
2 Swedish journalists traveled to Sweden after having been held for almost 2 months in Syria. The journalist, a freelance reporter and a photographer, went missing on November the 25th while on assignment in the war-torn country. They were released early in the week, and after a few days in Beirut, they were able to return to Sweden. They said they were mostly kept separate in dark cellars with only a little food and water. Both journalists said Syria was an incredibly dangerous place for Western journalists. U.S. House of Representatives Speaker John Boehner said President Barack Obama should authorize a more active American role in Iraq. But he stopped short of calling for the participation of U.S. troops there. Commenting on growing violence in Iraq, Boehner said a new U.S. troop presence was not called for at this time. The Iraqi government has sent more troops and military vehicles to Anbar province as operations continue to oust Al-Qaeda-linked militants. Here is more on the developing situation there.
Iraqi troops, tanks and military vehicles pour into the rest of Anbar province. The government sent the reinforcements to the region west of Baghdad as it battles against militants of Al-Qaeda's Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Iraqi forces have killed dozens of militants in recent days in shellings and airstrikes as they try to regain the cities of Fallujah and Ramadi that had been out of government control. Residents in Fallujah reported a calmer day after some overnight mortar fire. Militants were keeping a low profile. Troops on the outskirts made no attempt to enter the city, many of whose 300,000 residents fled after clashes last week. But it's not clear whether a deal reached between the government and Sunni tribal leaders under which the militants would withdraw and the army would stay outside Fallujah can end the tension. The battle in Anbar has led to fresh violence in the capital. A suicide bomber killed 23 Iraqi army recruits and wounded more than 30 others in Baghdad. The attack targeted responding to a government appeal for volunteers to help fight the militants in Anbar. Police said a man with an explosive vest blew himself up as were registering their names as the small Muthanna airfield used by the army in the Iraqi.
An explosion targeted the volunteers. A suicide bomber wearing an explosive belt detonated himself. All these people are looking for their daily living.
No group immediately claimed responsibility for the attack, which occurred a day after Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki vowed to eradicate Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Bloodshed in Iraq has returned to its highest level in 5 years, with the United Nations reporting more than 8,000 people killed last year. The bloodshed was fueled by the conflict in Syria. Hibal Atoum for the news at 10.
And back here at home, Jordan and the United States signed a 5-year, $140 million loan agreement to support public engagement and participation and civil society across the kingdom. The loan will also help local authorities rapidly identify and address community needs by establishing mechanisms that will bring citizens and their elected officials together to identify, prioritize and fund small but necessary projects to improve their communities. The agreement was signed in Erbil by Minister of Planning and International Cooperation Ibrahim Saif, U.S. Ambassador Stuart Jones and USAID Acting Mission Director Douglas Ball. Jones said during the ceremony that small investment could have a huge impact on entire communities. He noted that under the same program, there would be larger grants in the future to Jordanian organizations that are best placed to understand the needs of local communities. While in Erbil, the ambassador visited 2 of the 12 recently completed development projects that were part of USAID Community Engagement Project. Security forces arrested 5 men after shooting incidents at 2 restaurants in Jabal Amman in the past 2 days. Police said an investigation found that the shootings were over personal and financial feuds between the suspects and the restaurant's management. They said police initially apprehended the 2 major suspects, and an investigation led to the arrest of 3 other accomplices who carried out the shootings. The weapon used in the shootings, a pump-action shotgun, was seized in addition to the vehicle used by the shooters. Tunisia's Islamist Prime Minister Ali al-Raid resigned to make way for a non-partisan caretaker government. The resignation was part of a deal with his secular opponents to complete a transition to democracy. 3 years after an uprising against autocrat Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, Tunisia is in the final stages of establishing a full democracy before elections. Tunisia's new premier, technocrat Mahdi Jum'a, must tackle subsidy cuts sought by international lenders to curb the North African country's deficit and also confront a growing threat from Islamist militants. A month-long strike by local employees of the United Nations agency UNRWA has triggered more protest in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Residents at refugee camps burned tires and closed roads to protest a lack of services normally provided by UNRWA, the United Nations agency that cares for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. Scores of youths blocked a main road outside the Jalazun refugee camp north of the city of Ramallah and roads near camps inside the city. The demonstrations came as the Palestinian economy failed or falters while aid agencies and donors struggle to cope with deepening refugee crisis related to the civil war in neighboring Syria. The Palestinian Labor Union launched the strike in early December to object to a salary review the agency was conducting on its employees. But the UN agency said it did not have the sufficient funds to meet the wage demands. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said nuclear negotiations with world powers had revealed U.S. enmity towards his country. Khamenei was speaking hours before the resumption of talks between Iran and the European Union in Geneva. His comments at came as Iran and the European Union prepared to hold Geneva today to discuss the practical details of implementing a nuclear agreement reached in Geneva in November. U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Wendy Sherman is also due to take part. The Geneva deal was designed to halt Iran's nuclear advances for 6 months to buy time for negotiations on a final settlement. Polar vortex turned powerful Niagara Falls in the United States and Canada into a frozen winter wonderland. The deadly blast of Arctic air that enveloped the United States caused parts of the 54-meter American Falls covered in ice and the observation area to be frozen over. Large amounts of ice upriver from the falls led authorities to issue a flash flood warning for 2 islands in the area. Authorities had put about half of the United States under a wind chill warning or cold weather advisory. However, the frigid air and polar vortex that affected about 240 million people in the United States and southern Canada will depart during the second half of the week. In his 4th trip to North Korea, former U.S. basketball star Dennis Rodman led an auditorium of North Koreans in singing happy birthday to their leader. This came a day after he sparked controversy by appearing to suggest a Korean American was to blame for his captivity in North Korea. Rodman led a chorus of people in song to the leader of the isolated and heavily sanctioned country at a basketball match that Kim attended with his wife. Rodman brought a team of fellow former National Basketball Association stars to the North Korean capital Pyongyang to participate in the match. Cardiff City's new manager Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has made Heerenveen midfielder Wolfgang Ekram his first signing for the Welsh side. The 23-year-old Norwegian has helped win 2 Norwegian league titles under Solskjaer at Molde and was sold by the former Manchester United striker to the Dutch club last June. He has joined Cardiff for an undisclosed fee, although British media said they had paid about £2 million. Ekram expressed his delight at moving to Wales and linking up with Solskjaer, who's also Norwegian. Finally, very cold and partly cloudy tonight with a chance for heavy downpours and thunderstorms in the country's south. Snowfall is also forecast in the late night hours across the southern hilly areas. Winds will be northwesterly brisk, blowing dust in the Badia Desert region. Tomorrow, unstable conditions will continue to affect the country. Therefore, heavy downpours are in the forecast for much of the southern and eastern regions, and snowfall is also expected across the southern hilly areas. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect heavy rain and thunderstorms tomorrow with northerly brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. The weatherman warns of poor visibility in the Badia Desert region and flash floods in low-lying areas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now our top stories once again. The Prime Minister tells activists that Jordan's nuclear energy program is in the decision-making stage and vows that nothing will be imposed on Jordanians. Jordan and Iraq discuss details of a strategic oil pipeline between the two countries. And Jordan and Britain pledge full support to the Geneva II conference to boost peace prospects in Syria. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name's Raad Liptoush. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.